American University students and others have done through the Clean Global Initiative to help make the world a better place. And I know a lot of you are going to be delegates to the university meeting that we will have for the first time in Washington, D.C. this year. So I thank you for that. And Alex, I want to thank you for inviting me and for making me the first Wonk of the year. When I ran for president, you had all these handlers, and they worry how you're going to present yourself, what your image will be, And my buddy James Carville was helping me, and he's from Louisiana, and he said, Governor, he said, you can't be a Wonk and a redneck. You've got to be a Wonk or a redneck. We ain't never been a Wonk redneck. And I said, well, it's the first time I heard of it. I love when people make fun of me for being wonkies, because I figured people wanted a president who actually do something. I'm constantly amazed. I speak in places and people say, I can't believe you know anything about that. I'll be in Africa and on my knees digging in the topsoil and talking to people about agriculture. And I said, why is it that the only jobs in the world where people are surprised if you know anything about the history are in agriculture? If you teach economics in 8 years, you're going to know. Anyway, well, that's talking. I want to thank you, Matt, for that first. He's probably kind of so crap. The great thing about having others. The bad thing is nobody cares what you think. Say it anyway. Look, I want to talk about something serious. When I asked Al Gore, not as a lot of people make fun of, they said, Clinton has lost his mind. You need balance on the presidential ticket. Bush from the state next door, they're the same age. They are from the same wing of the party, There is no diversity here. I said, oh yes, there is. There's the most important diversity of all. I know about economics and healthcare, and education, and trade. He knows about climate change and information technology and weapon systems and the defense budget. That's the most important balance you can have. We need more people who know more things to have more creative conversations. Then people said, oh, Clinton had such a messy process. He'll talk about the budget for hours, and they'll debate all this stuff. And then then head of the National Economic Council, Bob Rubin, who has been one of the co-chairmen of Goldman Sachs, said, I think this is the best decision-making process I've ever been involved with. All the people who want you to have an orderly process don't understand that complex problems are best solved by large numbers of smart people debating all facets of it. So I say that to say, I want you to think with me tonight. Have your inner Wonk. And here's the question I want you to ask and answer to yourself. What kind of world do you want to live in? For the students here, when you have your own children, what kind of world do you want to bring your children into? When you leave it, what do you want to leave it like? I know the answer to that. I want to leave the world with more shared opportunity and prosperity, more shared responsibility, and greater shared sense of membership in communities, locally, nationally, and globally. I want people to revel in the magnificent diversity you have here, students from all 50 states, D.C., and 146 or so foreign countries. But I want you to believe that underneath your common humanity matters even more than your diversity. That's what I want. So here are the steps you can ask yourself, you can give yourself a different answer. But whatever your answer is, you should have an answer. And then you have to ask yourself, how do I get it? And I think there are certain elemental steps that everybody has to go through. First is, you have to get to the facts. What are the immutable characteristics? And especially, what is the defining characteristic of the world of the early 21st century? I believe that it is the most interdependent age in human history. It's far more than globalization. You don't have to go anywhere to get on the internet. In 30 seconds, a 10-year-old can find something I had to go to college to learn. I mean, we are, the whole government has now been brought down by social media sites. We are interdependent. What we do affects each other and may affect people half the world away. The Arab Spring begins in Tahrir Square in Tunisia, and all of a sudden, Libya is aflame and they're still fighting in Syria. And all the countries that did reasonably well had both sunk wealth, but also had self-initiated reform movements that predated the Arab Spring, but I'll guarantee you they speeded them up once it started. It is an interdependent world because of information technology and travel and trade and immigration. And there are lots of great things about it. I personally think one of the great underappreciated developments of the current age, because of our understandable preoccupation with the economic crisis here in Europe and around the world, is the breathtaking advances we've had in the last couple of years in science, often driven by multinational cooperation. In my last year as president, we finally succeeded in sequencing the human genome. I spent a lot, those of you who are old enough to be taxpayers when I was president, I spent a lot of your tax money on that. But not alone. We had a multinational consortium. And since then, just think of the stuff we've learned. On a very practical matter, we've already identified the two variations in the genome that make women more likely to develop breast cancer. It is just a matter of time when every young mother who has a young daughter will come home from the hospital with a gene card, which will say, your daughter has these two variations. So she should start having a mammogram starting at age 25. And by then, it'll all be done by nanotechnology. You go stand up in some little tube and get a scan and proof it'll be done. And then the current recommendation will make sense to all women that everybody else doesn't have to have mammograms till they're 50. But it will really be a shining breakthrough. There'll be lots of examples like that. We're getting close on Parkinson's. We're getting close on Alzheimer's. We may even learn to measure the genomic variances that put people in the zone of all the various kinds of autistic conditions, which is a really important sense. We tripled the number of young kids with autism in the last 20 years. So it's exciting. And then there, for me, as someone who spent a lot of his life in politics, by far the most important fact is that we are all at least 99.5% the same. But if you look around this room today, every non-age-related difference you can see in each other. Non-age-related. Whether you're tall or short, wide or narrow, whether you have some sort of disability or not, whether the color of your eye, even whether you're a man or a woman, every non-age-related difference you can see is rooted in at least 0.5% of your genome. Matter of fact, we had this raging debate almost a decade about whether we were 99.9 or 99.5% the same. Now, if you're not a scientist, look, with 3 billion genomes, it's not an insignificant number, but for political and social and psychological purposes, it is not significant. Just think of that. And yet, all of us spend 99.5% of our time thinking about that 0.5%, don't we? Well, I wish I were a little taller. I wish my hair wasn't gray anymore. I wish I had more hair. Or, more deadly, that person doesn't think the way I do. There's something wrong with them. They're not part of my crowd. Every difference that is sparked, every war in the history of humanity, biologically was rooted in 0.5% of our genomic makeup. Call that thought. But on a lighter note, last year, the funniest development in the human genome, it turns out that unless your ancestors, even if you're an African American, or even if you're from Africa, unless your ancestors are 100% from sub-Saharan Africa, 100%, which is nearly no one, even most sub-Saharan Africans don't have 100% of their genome back to the beginning of humanity from sub-Saharan Africa. Unless that's true, between 1 and 4% of your genome comes from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals. Because human beings came out of Africa somewhere between 90 and 120,000 years ago. And as far as we know, no Neanderthals ever came into sub-Saharan Africa. And they cohabited the earth with humans for, give or take, 40,000 years. It turns out they did more cohabitation than we had previously known. And after about 40,000 years, we survived and they didn't. They were bigger than we were. Their brains were about the same size ours were. They were much stronger than we were. As far as we know, for reasons we don't understand, they didn't ever learn to write or to have spoken language as we did. Well, we probably survived and they didn't because we could run and they couldn't. Because it was the era of giant mammals. You all know the old joke about the bear comes on 2 guys in the woods and one of them takes off running and he says, "Why are you running? We can't possibly outrun the bear." And the guy says, "I don't have to outrun the bear." So we outran the Neanderthals and we're still around. Now, Hillary and our daughter Chelsea, they didn't think this was a particularly... When I breathlessly explained all this to them, they said, "You know, we're not particularly impressed with that. I mean, we always knew you were part of the Neanderthal." But they were quite surprised to learn that they were too. Now we're laughing, but this can have enormous practical implications as we try to unpack the mysteries of our bodies and why some of us get some things and we're immune to others and others are different. This is a big deal. And this is all going on, even though I know the economy and the dumps and everything you've got. This will benefit you. It will change the horizons of your life. What you can imagine, what you can achieve. To give you another example, astrophysics. In the last 2 years, international efforts, including the Hubble telescope, have identified 10 planets outside our solar system that seem to be sufficiently far from their sun and sufficiently coherently composed that they may be able to support life as we know it. And may even have life as we know it. I would love to be 28. I would take my chances on becoming president again if I could be 20. Just because I'd like to know if there's somebody else out there. I'd like to see what's going to happen. So with all the problems at the moment, it's really not an occasion for pessimism if you look at these underlying scientific trends. And to me, the most exciting thing that has happened in the last year in particle physics. And America's biggest super collider is the Fermi Lab, University of Illinois, where they crash atoms at massive speed in a super collider. the scientists in this particular test were trying to examine the subatomic particle called the muon. And previous to this, to back up, everybody in physics thought that except for the neutral subatomic particle, the neurons, the neutrons, everything else had to have a positive or negative charge, and if they were both charges in a given kind of particle, they had to be in even balance. So the muons, it had always been assumed you had to have an even number of positive ones and an even number of negative ones, or otherwise the atom wouldn't cohere, and no matter would cohere, and all of us would just come flying apart. And it turned out, according to this experiment, that ever so slightly the positive ones outnumbered the negative ones, which for a crazy optimist like me was like manna from heaven. But, more importantly, it might explain how life emerged from single cell in the primordial slime to billions of years later, all of you sitting here tonight. People knew by observation and then by inference that something like what Darwin said was right, that there had been a significant amount of evolution over time. But nobody could ever explain it because they could never understand how this had happened because of the static conditions that had to be inherent within atoms. This is the first time there's ever been a chance to actually develop a unified theory that encompasses physics and biology and chemistry. It's a huge deal. Now, to be fair, this test, like all others, will have to be subject to rigorous reanalysis, and we don't know how it will come out, but if it does, it's a big deal. And then recently, to me, the most exciting of all, I'm sure a lot of you read about this, at the big superconductor in CERN, Switzerland, which I tried to build in Texas, and we lost the budget back in 93. We got a lot of benefits out of it, and that is an international thing. The United States contributes and has physicists on site. And one of the young men who work here happened to show up at our house with all the crowd my daughter brings home to Thanksgiving, so I got to talk to him about it. They fired into a magnet in the Italian Alps subatomic particles called neutrinos. And when they measured them, they seemed to have arrived before they left. What do I mean by that? It's the first time any scientific experiment appeared to measure something that with mass that travels faster than the speed of light. So I asked this young guy at Thanksgiving, I said, I'm so glad you're here. I've been thinking about this all night. When I saw you were coming, did this happen or not? Did you guys really check these numbers? He said, we checked it 9 ways from Sunday. He said, maybe it didn't happen. They'll have to have another test. But it appears to be the first recorded instance of something traveled faster than the speed of light. Then a couple of days later, by total accident, I was at a holiday party with Brian Greene. A lot of you have probably read his books on physics. They're widely available in bookstores, and he's a fascinating writer. So I said, so Brian, did the neutrinos get there before they left? Did something travel faster than the speed of light? He said, I don't think so. And I was crestfallen. He said, well, wait a minute. I said, so what are the possible answers? He said, there's a boring one and a thrilling one. I said, what's the boring one? He said, the boring one is that they didn't measure it right. Because it's really like a super accurate GPS system. So it's a long way. And when you're measuring things in billionths of a second, it's easy to make a mistake. But he said, it's possible they didn't make a mistake. I said, you just told me it couldn't travel faster than the speed of light. He said, I know. It took a shortcut. I said, what are you talking about? And we have a mutual friend who's a physicist. He's named Lisa Randall. We also like a lot of books about this. Proponent of string theory, and believe there are gaps in reality where matter can disappear and reappear. He said, they could have taken a shortcut. They could have dropped into a fourth dimension beyond time, space, and distance that we know and just taken a shortcut. I said, you mean there really is another dimension of reality and all these crazy people in Washington might be right, in some other world. And so he was laughing, we were having a good time with it. But he said, yeah, there might be. And he said, if that happened, it would be more exciting than if it traveled faster than the speed of light. Now, why am I telling you this? This will not change your world at all. Your watches will still work. All basic math calculations will still work. People will design and build buildings and they will not fall down. But it could totally change the human imagination and human consciousness. And I think that's important. Because I think the biggest constraints on building the world you want are in our minds and hearts and our imaginations. Because we think things are more important than they are, and important things we think are less important than they are, and it all starts with being obsessed with 0.5% of ourselves that are different from everybody else. And so I want to just talk to you about that a little tonight. Because there are perils to interdependence. Interdependence simply means that divorce is not an option. That's all it means. It can be good or bad or both. I've been talking about all the stuff that's good and exciting, but there's a lot of problems in the world we live in. The reason I like the Occupy Wall Street movement is that I talked about income inequality when I ran for president. I talked in 1991 and 92. I have talked about it in every speech I've given since 2001. And all these people camping out have done more to raise the issue in international consciousness than I did, giving speeches till I was blue in the face for more than a decade. And going back more than 20 years. So I thought that was good. The modern world, if you want a world of shared opportunities and prosperity and shared responsibilities, you just can't have as much inequality as we've got. I mean, half the world's people live on less than $2 a day. Before the earthquake in Haiti, 75% of people were living on less than $2 a day. 75% of people had no electricity in their home. Less than half the kids went to school. 68 million kids in the world today who are eligible to be in elementary school don't go. Another 70-something million who should be in middle school and early high school don't go. And at least that many combined go to school in name only because they don't have trained teachers or learning material. And we know in a poor country, every year of schooling adds 10% per year to earning capacity for life. One in 4 deaths this year on the planet, including wars, natural disasters, crime, and all other diseases. 1 in 4 of all deaths will come from AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and infections related to dirty water, cholera, dysentery, diarrhea. All diseases of the poor. We have a number of people with AIDS in America, but most of them will live normal lives. If they take their medicines, stay on their regime, they will. So, it's a very unequal world out there. And it's not healthy to have that much inequality. In America, the inequality comes largely when we don't create enough jobs for people to work themselves from poverty into the middle class, and to make the labor market tight enough for people to get a pay raise. And when healthcare costs keep going up at 3 times the rate of inflation, employers don't have as much money to raise pay as they otherwise would. And when people who are very vulnerable to losing their jobs are middle-aged people without a college education and without ready access to retraining for jobs that are available. And when we don't have the job mix changing in a way that is favorable. For example, in the years when I was president, the only time in the last 40 years when the bottom 20% income increased about the same percentage as the top 20%. Top 1%, 1/10 of 1% ran away with it when I was president too, but the 20% thing was constant. The reason information technology spread rapidly into every other aspect of our economy. It was 8% of our employment, but 20% of our job growth and 25% of our income growth. because that was export-related jobs, and manufacturing came back, and the export-related jobs paid 35% on average more than jobs in the non-export sector. So we got to do something about this in America and around the world. It's just not healthy. The second challenge of our interdependent world is it's highly unstable. Look how fast the financial crisis spreads, starts in America, spreads to the UK, spreads to Ireland, spreads to Iceland. All of a sudden, the whole world washes. Look at the vulnerability people feel to terrorists, organized crime, to drug trafficking, to trafficking in human beings. Look at the insecurity people feel across the border in the U.S. from the horrible drug violence in Mexico. And it's very hard to make all this stuff go away. I feel that indirectly my policies close that because we had this enormous cooperation with Colombia and with the Andean countries, and we stopped the traditional air and sea routes by which drugs were transported in America. So the same people figured out they'd go further into the rainforest and hide, give up the cities, and give them back to the people of Colombia. Medellin, which is the drug capital of the world when I became president, belongs to the people of Colombia again. It is a civilized state with citizens. People are still growing drugs, and now they can take them overland into Mexico, and it's impossible to police all of that. And there's so much money behind it. They have all this violence very often between rival drug gangs with a lot of innocent civilians caught in the middle. This, too, is part of our interdependent world. So there's a lot of instability out there. And some instability, like in the economy, is good. You have to have some risk in order for people to be creative and think they can be rewarded for it. But if the world you live in is too unstable, you just sooner or later start to shut down. People can only handle so much instability. If you have too much instability, nothing happens. If you have total stability, nothing happens. Right now in the world, there's too much instability. And then the third problem we have is the world is unsustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy, because it is changing the planet. And it's been very interesting to me that there has been, in all these presidential debates, nearly as I can tell, no one has asked any of these candidates a sensible question about climate change, because I think denial is the official position, so they think, why embarrass themselves? Never mind the 13 of the 14 hottest years ever recorded occurred in the last 16 years. And all the changes that are happening and the measurable decline that if you live in America or Northern Europe, your number one concern should be the measurable decline in the ice pack on Greenland. That's 8% of all the world's fresh water. If it melts as fast and goes into the North Atlantic, it can block the Gulf Stream flowing from south to north in the winter and turn the most productive economies in Northern Europe and parts of Canada and maybe even the northern United States as cold as they were 700 years ago in the mini ice age. So we take some of the most productive economies, some of the economies where there's greater social mobility than there is in America today, and shut them down for 3 months a year. This is a serious problem. If you're in Asia, you should worry most about the melting of the Himalayan ice pack, because that reflects back a lot of the heat from the planet. It keeps it cooler, and it could wreak havoc with agriculture in Asia. If you live in Russia, you should worry most about the melting of the permafrost in Siberia across the north of Russia, because of all the places on Earth that are frozen, that's the one that had the most habitation before it froze. So underneath that are all these structures, mostly wood, that will emit massive amounts of methane gas, which is 23 powerful than carbon as a greenhouse gas, if it all falls. So this is a serious deal. And this is something I want you to think about. There were probably 5% or fewer of the climate scientists, serious scientists studying this in the world who questioned whether the believers in climate change had overstated it. And it wasn't that big a deal. And there are a lot of people who've written like compelling books about it. There's a whole cottage industry around it because it helps to keep the traditional energy sources flowing. So the most respected scientist in America, who was a climate skeptic, besides Freeman Dyson, who's a liberal Democratic 84-year-old physicist from Princeton, but has not done a lot of serious work. The most respected one is a physicist from Cal Berkeley named Muller. And he got a massive amount of money from a lot of anti-climate change interests and others to do a study, because Muller had a really sensible idea. He said, I think we have exaggerated this problem because they took all their climate measurements too close to cities. And we all know cities are hotter than non-cities. I mean, I live in a little town 20 miles north of New York. And when I get up in the wintertime on a cold day and drive down to my office in Harlem, when I go to my office and I get out, it's always 10 degrees hotter than it is. It was a reasonable thing to do. So Muller got all this money, and the day came when he was to send his findings to the relevant House committee in the new Congress, so they were ecstatic that he was coming in. He was going to puncture the pinata of climate change. And the guy said, thank you very much, and I appreciate the people who funded my project. I did 1 point, either 3 or 6 billion temperature measurements. I corrected for all the biases I was convinced were there, and my conclusion is, the other guys are right. You could have heard him in the hearing. He said, I did this. I'm telling you, the world is warming at an unsustainable pace. Human behavior is finally contributing to it. I'm not telling you exactly what we ought to do about it, but we better do something because this is going to be really bad if we don't. I don't think that was on the front page of any newspaper in America. I don't think it was on any evening news. It has never been asked in any debate. This was a massive story. You got to be a 65-year-old retired politician sitting at home reading every blog site you can get your hands on to find out that there was a congressional hearing in which this happened. This is a huge deal. And I'm going to tell you, so, now, having said that, I do not believe, particularly in the current economic climate, there will ever be an agreement on climate change on targets until you prove it's economically viable. Al Gore has now, I think today, left for the South Pole. He's taken a big, very distinguished group of Americans down there to look at the South Pole, and they're going to see how it's breaking up and breaking off, and all bad things can happen. I spend most of my time doing really boring stuff like changing the street lights in Los Angeles, because I'm convinced that you may have seen President Obama and I were out here at the office building not very long ago, a retrofit of an office building. You have got to prove this is good economics, or we're not going to fix it. And every one of you has a vested interest in that. You will destroy the opposition to it if you can prove that energy efficiency and clean energy is good economics. That changing the way you produce and consume energy, if you're smart about the way you do it, will generate more new businesses, more new jobs, and more economic growth than it will cost. And I'm telling you, it will. I have been working on this for years now. But, and don't misunderstand me, I'm really glad these guys are going to the South Pole, because they'll have a big different voice when they come back, and they'll be able to speak with authority, and they'll make a difference. But we still have to figure out how to do it. So, if the world is great, but too unequal, too unstable, and too unsustainable, it's obvious that what your job is, if you want a future of shared prosperity and shared responsibility, is to build a positive and reduce the negative forces of our interdependence. And I just want to make 2 quick points, then we'll go to questions. That job is really different in poor countries and rich ones. And different still, and maybe hardest of all, in the rising countries like China, India, and Brazil. If you have a poor country, you have to build systems. Because systems are what got most of you into these chairs today. Now, I know there's 1,000 different stories here. And I know a lot of you had to overcome a lot of obstacles. But let's face it, I mean, I counted up, I think I've done 20 different things to earn money by the time I went to college. But none of us were born in a log cabin that we built ourselves. Somewhere along the way, you had an education, you had a job, you had an opportunity, somebody helped you, and you wound up here. Systems give predictable, positive consequences to human effort. That's what they do. So look around here. You would be surprised if the lights went off, the microphone failed, the screen went dark, if the air conditioning didn't work. I spent a lot of my life in places where none of that could be taken for granted. 2 years ago, I was in Tanzania going to visit one of our reforestation projects. It took me an hour and a half to go 18 kilometers. When I got there, I was with people who didn't know who I was. I just was some tall, funny-looking guy with white hair. But they had made highly intelligent decisions about what to do with the revenues they were earning from the reforestation. They made a lot of sense, and they made this call that I would never have thought to make, which proves once again that intelligence is evenly distributed throughout the world, but structure and opportunity are not. You have to build systems. That's what I'm trying to do in Haiti. Build systems. In wealthy countries like America and the EU now, they're going through. Everybody's looking for what's the right fix. I have strong feelings about the economic policy issues, but the fundamental thing is this. Once you've been around a long time, if you go all the way back to the Sumerians 8,000 years ago, you will see that all great civilizations build systems. That's how they become great. And then the systems get long in the tooth because the people running them, in the public and private, become more interested in holding on to their positions than advancing the purposes for which the institutions were established. More interested in present gain than future expansion of opportunity to others. And America's been around the longest freely elected government in human history because somehow or another we managed to stay in the future business when it mattered most. So that's what I would say to you about America. We can talk if you want, Professor, about the economic policy or whatever, but I'm for whatever puts us into the future business, which means that all of our public and private power centers have to be focused on purpose more than holding on to present position, on advancing the future rather than just holding on to present gain. But everywhere I work, poor-rich countries have an issue. The rising economies, the problem they face is they have to do both. China's moved more people out of poverty in less time than any country in history, not just because it's the most populous place on earth, but because they found a way to make this work. They also have terrible problems. Their chemical industry centers with very high rates of cancer. They have people producing powdered eggs that aren't powdered eggs, they're some powdered chemical. The government is, in other words, trying to develop the capacity of things you expect the EPA or the FDA or the Agriculture Department to do for you, that they just couldn't have done it. Just everything exploded. They have all these people coming to the cities, and they got to create enough jobs for them, and yet they still got a lot of people living in rural areas, and nobody's figured out how to spread the economic growth out there. India has the world's biggest middle class, about 350 billion. Large number of billionaires. They also have the world's largest number of really poor people, more than China. Why? Because unlike the Chinese, they are more entrepreneurial, but less adept at aggregating and investing capital in infrastructure. So there are roads and railroads and airports and systems that have good education systems and other things that you get when you can aggregate. So they have to deal with that. Brazil is the most environmentally responsible big country in the world and also the most environmentally challenged. They need more power. 85% of it's clean. It's all from hydropower. They want to build 3 more dams. Unfortunately, the only available rivers are in the rainforest. So they have to take the rainforest down and destroy one 2,600-year-old Indian tribe if they're going to build these dams. Do they have options? Brazil just finished 4 years in a row winning the world's most efficient biofuel, their sugarcane ethanol, which gives you 9.3 gallons of ethanol for every 1 gallon of gasoline. More than 3 times as efficient as corn ethanol. They've used more ethanol than gasoline for 4 years in a row. They want to produce more. They don't need the rainforest. They need the deep topsoil they have. The problem is, the more of the deep topsoil they use, the more they push the cattle farmers, cattle ranchers, and the soybean farmers into the rainforest, because soybeans have tiny little food structure. Brazil's doing the best job of trying to handle their problems because they got a process where it's totally different from American politics today. I'll tell you 2 stories. 2 years ago, the ethanol producers invited me to Brazil and said, we are racked with worry that we are doing our job, but we are pushing cattle and soybeans into the rainforest. Tell us how we can do our job and stop this. They know that Amazonia is a global resource. They know it's 20% of the world's oxygen comes from non-ocean sources. They know there are thousands and thousands of plant and animal species that are irreplaceable. They asked me, and I gave them some ideas. But the point is, they're asking. This last year, we had a conference on the edge of the rainforest, and you had every oil company, every electric company, every ethanol producer, big sizes, all the business lobby, the head of the Green Party, the people that want more solar and wind power, representatives of the Indian tribes that don't want to destroy the rainforest, the whole gamut. Can you imagine what it would be like in America if you had a meeting like that today at the current climate? They're sitting calmly in a room, talking to each other, treating each other with respect. They know there's no perfect resolution of this, and they set a process where they're at least trying to come to a consensus. It was really, that's the last point I want to make here. In modern politics, not just here, and not just in democratic society, but all around the world, what seems to work is conflict and organized division driving the biggest stake you can in the opposition. But in the real world, what works is cooperation and networking. Look at the prosperity centers of America. Orlando has 100 computer simulation companies because of the cooperation of NASA, the Defense Department, the private sector, the University of Central Florida, the technology transfers, the constant training. Those people don't know we've been through a recession. Silicon Valley is back. But south of there in San Diego is the center of human genome research and development. The Cleveland Clinic and the community college in Cleveland is doing perhaps the best job in America of taking out-of-work, middle-aged, undereducated people that never get to go back to a job like they had and training them for the future job. Why am I telling you this? Look, I was in politics for years. I hate it when people that used to be in politics pontificate to people that are still there. You're in business, you want to win, and as we see one more time, negative campaigning works. People whine about it, but as long as voters reward it, people will do it. But I'm just telling you, we've got to somehow bring it in a little bit and throw America into the future a little more. And I think the fact that there are more younger people who are in the electorate, and the electorate is more diverse than it used to be, is going to bring a big shift in the way America thinks and votes. I think that's one of the reasons for the level of desperation and the rhetoric and everything among people who don't think that way. But when I go around the world now and do this work, which you saw about in the film, I get help from Republicans and Democrats and people in all political parties in other countries. Because all I care about is results. And I can just tell you this, I always felt this way, even in the heat of every campaign. When you were done with all this, whatever your this is, whatever your dream is, when you are finished, there are basically only 3 things that matter. people better off when you quit than when you started. The young people have a brighter future. And are we coming together or being torn apart? Everything else is background music. All of the thrills of every campaign and all that stuff, I love politics. I love every day. The bad days are here. But I'm telling you, when it's over, what keeps you going, what keeps you driving is knowing whatever it is you do, that you can make a difference. And it's what animates me today. We lost that. So that's what I would say to you. What do you want the world to be like? If you, like me, want to raise your kids in a world of greater shared opportunities, shared prosperity, shared responsibilities, with a shared sense of community, you've got to reduce inequality, instability, and unsustainability. You've got to build opportunity. And you've got to do it in a way that brings people together, not drives them apart. And you have to recognize, and this is something that the people on my side of the political aisle are just as guilty of, I'm afraid. In America today, we have gotten rid of most of our bigotry. We are not as sexist, we are not as racist, we are not as homophobic as we used to be. We want to empower people with disabilities to an extent greater than ever in the history of our country. We are moving in the right direction. We have one remaining bigotry. We don't like being around people that disagree with us. I'm telling you, you can see it in changing population patterns. You can see it in the fact that we have 50-11 options for getting our news, so we just pick people we agree with. And a few years ago, a man named James Sorolecki wrote a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, in which he documented instance after instance after instance, in which if you get a diverse group of reasonably intelligent people and give them a complex, multifaceted problem over and over and over and over again, they will make decisions better than any genius, no matter how brilliant, sitting alone in a room. Whether we like it, you have to forge the future together. Thank you very much.
Highest per capita Wonk policy, political wonks at any university in the United States. We're very proud of it. They work on the Hill, they work in the White House, they work in campaigns, and this was the perfect speech. I can tell that they loved it. Now, we had 100 questions submitted by the students. And I'm asked to ask you some of the questions. Don't worry, we won't go through 100. They were selected by the Political Union. And I want to start with the first one, and I want to mention the person's name. Dean Collins.
Are you here?
Are you here? She has a very good question, and it's about what's in your soul to a certain extent. It's leaving, after leaving office, and I would ask also while you were in office, what motivated you to stay in public service, become involved with domestic and international problems, give so much? Where did it come from?
Well, I did it because it made me happy. I did it because, the funny answer is I wasn't good enough to play on the senior golf tour. And my saxophone skills were too rusty for me to make a living as a jazz musician. But the truth is, I've had the most improbable life. There have only been 2 governors of small states in the history of America who have elected president. I was lucky. Yeah, I worked hard and tried to do a good job, but I was lucky. I think that the real question would be, what kind of person would I be if I had taken all that knowledge, all that experience, that life that the American people gave me, beginning with the people of Arkansas who let me be governor for a dozen years, and taken 8 years as president and just walked away. I wanted to do this. I had more fun doing this than anything else. I love, being in Rwanda, helping farmers triple their income. I love working with Dr. Paul farmers, building hospitals in every region of Rwanda, and then building clinics and then training just ordinary people to be outreach workers. And I love that stuff. It's inherently interesting to me. It's totally selfish. I'm having more fun doing this than I could just be sitting around. I love it.
Let's do the next question. It's from Billy Keogh. Billy? Here? I hope so. Because it's a good question. It's totally related to what you're just saying, and that is, we think your greatest accomplishment is in leading office, probably through the Clinton Global Initiative.
Well, I think
the best thing you've done.
I think it's a close call between two things, but the Clinton Global Initiative made me because it's my attempt to do what I told you to do in the speech. That is, the Clinton Global Initiative meets once a year at the opening of the UN, and we charge a membership fee much cheaper than Davos because you have to travel New York traffic to the opening of the UN instead of skiing. But it's the only meeting of its kind where, in order to come and in order to come back, you actually have to promise to do something. You go to these meetings and then nobody ever actually do anything. We do. If you come to our meeting, if you're a private citizen or an NGO, you're supposed to make a commitment. So we invite business people and philanthropists, and then every year we fly in non-governmental leaders from the poorest countries in the world. We cover all their costs, we bring them in, and we all sit around and have organized discussions about what works in areas of great challenge to the world and to America, and then everybody makes a commitment. Or they don't, but if they don't, we don't invite them back next year. And we're about to have the second one just for America, which I will continue until America returns to full employment. And we're about to have the fifth one just for university students. And every one of them, each in their own way, has been amazing. With the Clinton Global Initiative, and this will be our 7th year, we've had commitments already worth, when they're fully implemented over a 10-year period, almost $70 billion. And we can document that they've already helped 300 million people in 170 countries. And last September's commitment will take us to 400 million people in 180 countries. So that's really a big deal. And I didn't do that. What I did was set up a network which empowered other people to relate to each other, which is what I'm trying to tell you I think really works. Now, my own foundation, the biggest thing we've done so far is the AIDS work, because half the people in the world, in poor countries who get medicine, get all contracts renegotiated for the least expensive, high-quality AIDS medicine in the world, because we build out health systems to do the same thing with malaria medicine now. I do that work with the AIDS Foundation, with the American program, with the Global Fund on HIV and malaria, with the French-inspired Pro-Community, which buys medicine for poor people around the world. So we do that. And in America, the most important thing we've done is the Childhood Obesity Initiative, which, among other things, has reduced by 88% the total combined calories and drinks consumed by children in schools in both vending machines and cafeterias. So, but I would say, in order, those are the most important things we've done.
Well, that's a wonderful list. This is a tough one. When you were president of the United States, you balanced the budget, you grew the economy, the percent GDP gap went down. We now have serious problems with the deficit. We have serious problems with Europe economically. Gabby Lopez, an economics major. Are you here, Gabby? Don't be bashful, please. She asks, what would you do to address the current economic and financial crisis of our country? I would add, how do you get the votes for it? You have a great book, Back to Work, Why We Need Smart Government for a Strong Economy, but we've got a dysfunctional Congress with nobody in the middle anymore. How do you get the votes?
balanced budgets and surpluses. The last one was the one I sent to the Congress that had to be enacted after I left. But a lot of people associate John Maynard Keynes with deficit spending, and it's the answer to every problem. But the truth is, they didn't really read it very closely, because Keynes said what I believe: when there is no growth or a recession because there is no demand in the private sector, or the capital markets drive or something else, then the government should step in and make investments that help people go back to work. But when the growth returns, government should run on a balanced budget or a surplus. Keynes was a fiscal conservative in times of growth and a fiscal liberal in times of recession. The problem we face today is governments all over the world, including the United States, after I left office, we went back to what we were doing before. We let the pay-as-you-go rule expire. We had all these tax cuts, off to wars, and all that stuff. You know the difference. And so, once again, we started running deficits in times of growth. And in a lot of other countries, Greece being Exhibit A, it's worse. So what happens is your credit runs dry. Everybody says, we don't want to give you money. We want you to practice austerity. But you can't get blood out of a turnip. Look at what happened in the UK, a country I respect, and they're doing okay, but their austerity budget is not going to give them a balanced budget, because if there is no private activity and you cut public activity, there's a good chance that your revenues will drop more than your spending will be cut. That's the ultimate dilemma. So what do I think should be done? I think that we should take that Simpson-Bowles report and the one Alice Rivers, Meet the Minutes you did, and all the other bipartisan agreements. And we ought to work from that. I don't agree with everything Simpson-Bowles report. And Erskine Bowles is one of my closest friends in the world and one of the most able people I ever worked with. But I agree with a lot of it, and it's a good starting point. And we should adopt a plan to move us back toward a balanced budget. I would be for doing it even faster than they did, but I wouldn't start it until at a minimum next year. This economy needs more time to heal. We need more growth. Meanwhile, I would try to get some cash in here. I try to repatriate some of that offshore cash, raise some money, and set up an infrastructure bank like the bipartisan bill in the Senate called for, which would use public money to seed it at $10 or $15 billion, and then accept private investment. Every other major country in the world allows public and private partnerships in infrastructure investment, and there's a heck of a return on investment. It's a good deal, and it's a lot more reliable right now than the markets are, because they're shaky. And so we're in a position to do that. But I think it would be a great mistake to go to austerity too quickly, because, look, I passed this real tough budget. Before the Balanced Budget Act of 1996 ever passed, because of the Budget Act of 1993, we got rid of 95% of the deficit. With a balanced budget, we hadn't done anything. But why? Because the problem when I took office was the deficit had been quadrupled in the 12 years before I took office. It worked like a charm for President Reagan and then show for President Bush. What happened? We never run permanent deficits in the whole history of the country. So, we basically gave everybody all the candy they wanted and they never had to go to the dentist. And it created a lot of jobs in the short run, but then interest rates got so high, everybody said, look, we're going to make the Americans pay more for their debt. That drove the interest rate structure up. So by getting rid of a lot of that deficit immediately, I drove interest rates down. The bond market went up. Private investment went crazy, and 92% of our job growth was in the private sector. But if President Obama tried to do that now, it would not work, because he has no interest rates to reduce. So the trick is, on the other hand, people think we're going to be running this level of deficits and running this kind of debt up for time immemorial. So what I wish they would do is pass a bill this year that would start next year, or start whenever the unemployment rate reaches some figure. It's a really big deal. And I have all kinds of theories about how to get back to full employment. That's what it looks like.
Wait a minute, we had a super committee that had all the answers, and they couldn't get a vote out of it.
I know that, but that's because, in part, the Democrats did what they were for in general, but not in particular. The people hated the particulars that the Republicans came out with because they were designed basically to leave me with all my tax cuts. Because they said you don't want to raise taxes on the job providers in a recession. And I do have hundreds of employees, but that's ridiculous. The truth is, wait. Truth is, we don't need to be raising taxes or cutting spending now in this recession. But it's the least harmful thing to do to get to raise more money would be to take some of my tax cuts away, because I don't spend all the money I make every year. And so it would certainly have to be done. But you cannot get this budget under control without three things. You're going to have tax increases for the people who can afford to pay it, which I hope will come into context with tax reform, simplifying and getting rid of a lot of deductions. Look, most wealthy people I know think they should pay more, but they would prefer to have a lower, simpler rate structure and fewer deductions and fewer credits. You have to have more revenue, you have to have more spending restraint in the areas where it's exploding, and you have to have economic growth. And if you take out any one of those three things, you will not get to a balanced budget. We don't have economic growth today. If you try to do it all, whether you did it with tax increases or spending cuts, you could not get there because there is not enough growth. And there is no interest rate to drop because we're being fiscally prudent. So what I'd like to see us do is send all the investors in the world a big signal. Here's our plan. I'd make it even tougher than sensible. I hate all this debt. But you cannot get blood out of a turnip. We've got to have some growth before we can get this budget under control, because people got to be making money to pay taxes. So that's what I would do. I'd have a long-term plan. I wouldn't start until next year, and then I'd go to town and try to generate jobs this year in all the ways that I said in my book. And I'd resolve this home mortgage crisis quicker. There's a progressive way to do it, the less progressive way to do it. Trust me, I far prefer the progressive way, which essentially would be to write down the mortgages or string out the term and tell the banks, if you give us a break today, we'll split the profits with you tomorrow. When the property prices return, you'll get your money back. That way you can make accounting adjustments for it, clean up the bank books, and get bank lending going again. But we'd be better off doing, and then get all the people that are being foreclosed on, give them these houses that have been foreclosed on that haven't been sold, and charge them enough rent to maintain the house and the yard, to pay the utilities, to pay the property taxes, and let them see that, because you don't want all these houses going onto the market, driving people's houses down for them. That's the quickest thing we can do to get ordinary bank lending going again. And the more we delay this, the worse it is. So I'm hoping the administration is going to make this deal with the attorneys general and the banks, and that'll help some. What the president said, some in the State of the Union would help. But in the end, you've got to move massive amounts of these bad debt off these bank books if you want normal economic activity return. For 500 years, financial collapses have taken between 5 and 10 years to get over. For the last couple of hundred years, with businesses and buildings have been widely owned by private entities, like American University's buildings here. If you have a real estate collapse, it almost always takes 10 years. We don't need to take 10 years. But the president should not be held responsible for the fact that we were not over this by November of 2010. It didn't even bottom out until July of 2009. No power on earth for the 60 people in this. But on the other hand, so that's what I do. There is president, bipartisan president for that. Here's what's going to happen. If the Republicans become convinced that, they become convinced that their nominating process, which for me as a Democrat has been a beautiful thing. But anyway, they become convinced that they it might be possible for the president, with no matter what unemployment is, to win 40 states, then there'll be much more cooperation this year. I mean, butter won't melt in their mouth. They think that, apocalypse is the alternative. If they believe that after they pick a nominee, they got a chance to have a good convention and make this a competitive race, then you'll have to wait till after the next election. After the next election, I believe the president will be reelected and the handle it. I believe after the next election, even if the Republicans retain control of the House, even if they win the Senate, I think there'll be a much higher level of cooperation because the American people will be sending them a signal radically different from what they thought the signal was in 2010, when they had a very different electorate than the one that's going to show up in November of 2012. That's what I think will happen. That's what happened with me. Everybody's forgotten, they said, oh, why can't they have bipartisan cooperation the way you do? The reason is, we had a really bad year and they shut the government down twice and the people sided with me and I got reelected. And so we had 5 good years. 1 year in the election year we got a lot done. Then we did all this other stuff. But we had a bad year first. So what happens is you have a bad year after an election. If you have 92, 94, or 2008, 2010, it can't be a good year. The next year can't be good because the voters send 2 different signals. And it's going to be all right, I think. I really do.
One final question. It's a very personal question. I think it's a good question from Taro Ola. It's a question about empathy, and it reminds me of your speech after the tragedy of Oklahoma City, where you really transformed America in terms of focusing on that tragedy, moved America. He asks, how has empathy driven your success in politics and life?
Well, first of all, I give a lot of credit to my mother and my extended family. I was the first person in my family ever to go to college. But I had all these older relatives that had astronomical IQs and elementary level education. They didn't have any money. I was 10 years old before I got a television. I grew up in a storytelling family. And before you could tell a story in my family, you had to be able to listen. And if you were a kid, you had to be able to tell what you'd heard. I had a great uncle who died when I was president in 91. I bet you was like he was 95. I had a brilliant aunt who died when I was president of all time. And my grandmother was very smart. All on my mother's side. But anyway, I grew up learning that everybody had a story and that everybody was inherently interesting, that everybody had their own dream, their own theme, their own fear. And just because they couldn't talk very well didn't mean they weren't interesting. You had your eyes open, you could find something interesting about everything. That's where I was raised. I deserve no credit. But that's where I was raised. And I give a lot of credit to my 8th grade science teacher. I had an 8th grade science teacher who was one of the most unattractive men I ever saw in my life. It's most important. You forget everything else I said tonight, you remember this right. I was 13 years old. That was 52 years ago. I remember it was yesterday. His name was Bernard Coach. He was an ex-coach. He taught 8th grade science. He was a little overweight. He wasn't working out, he wasn't coaching anymore. And he wore these tight shirts and tight pants, and the belt was tight and kind of exaggerated his amplification. And he wore big bow glasses and a big nose, and he smoked inexpensive cigars in a plastic cigar holder that forced him into his mouth like this. And he had a really good looking wife who had a really good looking sister were our history and geography teachers. They were wonderful. And the Dokies, Vernon Dokie's wife's name was Vernon, and they loved each other so much. It was beautiful. I'm telling you, beautiful. So here's why I'm telling you this about him. Vernon Dokie said to us one day in class, he said, kids, I'm going to tell you one thing. When you grow up, you won't remember a darn thing about 8th grade science. If you don't remember anything else, I teach you, you remember this. He said, every morning when I wake up, I go in the bathroom and I wash my face and I put shaving cream on and I shave. And I wash the shaving cream off. And I look in that mirror and I say, Vernon, you're beautiful. He said, you remember that. Everybody wants to believe they're beautiful. And 52 years later, you think about that. Empathy is nothing more than imagining how the world is received by someone who is not you. You get it when someone's child died. The worst thing you ever had anything about. I spent a little time today with one of my closest friends who just lost one of his sons. But in little ways, you can practice. Next time you go into a cafeteria and a bunch of people leave, look around and see if you can figure out what's going on in everybody else's life.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.